as you open the book of Nehemiah, in those days the cupbearer is one of the highest officials in the court. Why? Because in those days those kings were tyrants. And tyrants were always afraid that people would murder them. So, before they drink from the cup, the cupbearer would drink it first, and then hand it to the king. There must be such closeness between the cupbearer and the king. The cupbearer was the confidante of the king, a close friend of the king. The king, as it were, trusted his life to the cupbearer. And the cupbearer was willing to give up his life for the king, because if there was poison, he died. He died for the king. So there must be such intimate relationship between the king and the cupbearer. A trusted friend, a bosom friend of the king. And Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king. The Persian court at that time was the highest court in the world. It was the time of the Persian Empire. And to be in the Persian court and to occupy such a high position almost next to the king. Of course, he lived a life of comfort and luxury. There was no want whatsoever. He was a Jew. But providentially, he was occupying such a position. And he was enjoying all that the Persian Empire could offer to anybody. But his heart was in Jerusalem. If he was free to go back, he will be in Jerusalem. How can I prove it? Because his brother Hananiah was in Jerusalem. He couldn't go to Jerusalem because he was the cupbearer. He was not free to go. He had to get permission from the king to go. But his heart was with Jerusalem. Oh, he was like Daniel. Even though Daniel was in Babylon, and yet his heart was in Jerusalem. Every day he opened a window towards Jerusalem and prayed 3 times a day. Dear brothers and sisters, where is your heart? You may be providentially placed somewhere else, but where is your heart? To be where God wants you to be. To be where you should be. To be in Jerusalem for the testimony of God. This is the place where every faithful one in Israel must be. Nehemiah couldn't go, but his heart was there. He was concerned with the conditions of the remnant there. His brother Hananiah and son came back from Jerusalem for a visit. And they brought that news to Nehemiah. Nehemiah was anxious to hear the news. What happened to those who remained in Jerusalem? You remember, the temple was already built for 50 years, or 55 years. But evidently, they were in such affliction and reproach because the city lay in ruin. There was no wall. The gates were burned. There was no protection. They were surrounded by enemies. Even though there was a temple, and yet it was exposed. And because of that, many who returned, probably at that time, had come back to Babylon. Because if you read carefully, Nehemiah said, those who escaped and remained. Probably many who at first went to Jerusalem to be where God wanted them to be. And then it became so difficult, they got so discouraged, so they packed up and returned to Babylon. But thank God there was still some hanging on. in much affliction and reproach. But they hang on. They surrounded the temple. They refused to go away. They had no place to go. They were where they should be. Where else could they go? But they were in great difficulties, with much affliction and reproach. No protection. They could be annihilated any moment. Any moment. When Nehemiah heard this, he sat down and wept. He prayed. He fasted for days, for nights. He was so concerned. He went to the Lord, not because he was in Persian court. He was well protected. He was the favorite of the king. Therefore he forgot his brethren. His heart was dead. Oh, as Moses, when he grew up, he refused to be called the son of the daughter of Pharaoh. He will rather suffer with his brethren. He esteemed the reproach of Christ as more precious than all the riches of Egypt, because he has seen the unseen. Brothers and sisters, this was Nehemiah. He did not put himself in a different position. His heart was one with the suffering remnant. He confessed his sin, his father's sin, for all Israel. He pleaded with God. And as he pleaded with God, God's call came to him. Go back to rebuild the wall. Brothers and sisters, what is your concern today? Is it because you can live comfortably? You do not care. Those who want to maintain the testimony of Jesus, it is difficult. Much affliction and reproach. On the verge of annihilation. Do you give yourself to prayer? Do you plead with God on their behalf? And if you do, I believe the burden of the Lord will come upon you. Go back. Rebuild the wall. The lives of God's people together needs to be rebuilt. Nehemiah received a burden from the Lord. So he prayed, Lord, let me find favor with that man. And that man is the king. The king is but a man. Nehemiah knew the Lord called him to go back, to rebuild the wall. But he did not move on his own. He waited upon God. A few months passed. You know, sometimes if we feel we have received some mission from God, immediately we move out. If we know God, don't do that. He waited upon God patiently. Every day, the burden gets heavier. Maybe after a few months, if you don't have faith, you will wonder whether you will ever go. And during all those months, as he served the cup before the king, he had to put up a joyful face. His heart was crying, but he must smile. He tried until a few months passed. And one day, as he lifted the cup to the king noticed his face was sad. And the king said, why? There must be something that troubles you. And Nehemiah was afraid. You know why? No one can appear before the king with a sad face. Especially the cupbearer. Why? Because if the cupbearer should appear before the king with a sad face, the king immediately becomes suspicious and says, well, what are you thinking? It was a capital crime. But Nehemiah couldn't help it. After a few months, he just couldn't restrain himself anymore. So he lifted his heart to God before he answered the king. And God gave him that opportunity. He said, "O king, how can I be glad when my father's throne were in ruin?" The king said, "What do you want? Let me go back, rebuild the city, rebuild the wall." And the good hand of the Lord was upon him. The king said, "How long will you be away?" And let him go. Dear brothers and sisters, how we need to wait upon the Lord. And if we wait upon the Lord, He will open a way for us to rebuild the unity of the brethren.